Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are talking about the 1970 movie Tora, Tora, Tora that depicts the events leading up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The film was produced by Elmo Williams and directed by Richard Fleischer. That's the American side of the production. And then the Japanese side of the production was directed by Toshio Masudo and Kinji Fukasaku. And it was written by Larry Forrester, Hideo Oguni, Ryuzo Kikushima, and Akira Kurosawa. What did you think of this movie?
I have mixed feelings about this movie. When I started watching it, I thought I was gonna hate it. The first 20 minutes were very boring for me, and then it picked up and I really liked it. It's a mixed bag for me. How about for you?
Yeah, I think that it's a certain style of movie and you have to kind of be in the mindset for it. And if you're a history buff, you'll probably enjoy it a lot more than a non-history buff. But I thought the Pearl Harbor action scene itself was really good. And I always enjoy some historical accuracy. So, like you, I would agree. I was a bit of a mixed bag on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the historical accuracy is one of the big pluses. As well as for me, one of the high points of this movie was that the American side and the Japanese side were portrayed kind of equally in terms of screen time, as well as who's to blame and who's evil and who's good. There wasn't really a good or evil kind of vibe to it, which I kind of liked. But I did feel that it lacked a little bit on the storytelling side of things.
I agree. And I think you can really tell that it was different sort of directors and production teams on each side. The directorial style of the Japanese side, I would say I enjoyed a lot better than on the American side. So, yeah, you can tell it was two different sort of teams that put the two sides of the movie together.
Also, I don't know if you noticed this or if you thought it was a thing as well, but I thought that the Japanese seemed to have a better sense of humor than the Americans did.
Yeah, with the American side, quite often it felt like they were just reciting exposition at each other. Yeah, but the Japanese side, there seemed to be just a bit more life in the scenes, I guess.
Yeah, I do wonder though if that's also because we don't understand Japanese. And when you don't understand a language, you are less likely to get intonation. And to me, the Japanese side seemed more like excited or scared or angry than the Americans did. But that's also because I know what they were saying. So I don't know if that makes a difference or not.
Yeah, I think too, when you have a movie that was made, I mean, this movie came out in 1970, the way that people speak or Americans speak in those movies is very like, now see here, pal, it's very important that we talk about this right now. And you're just like, well, that doesn't sound like we expect people to talk these days. And you're right, like neither of us speak Japanese, so we don't know if they're speaking in this weird tone of voice or not.
Yeah, and even still, the sentence you just said, kind of an excited sentence. And then if there
Yeah.
was one of those in the movies that just looked bored or something, I don't know what was going on there. It seemed like they were kind of just talking at a constant level with no emotion whatsoever.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
But but overall, I thought the closer you got to the actual attack, the more exciting it got. So that's the good thing for me.
For sure. Yeah, they did start ratcheting up the tension a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about this box office information?
I can certainly do that. These numbers don't really mean anything to me, but when it came out, the movie was thought to be a disappointment in North America. It had a box office of $29 million in the domestic box office, making it the ninth highest grossing film of 1970. It was, however, a major hit in Japan, and over the years, home media releases provided a larger overall profit. The film had earned, let me get this right, it earned 194 million yen. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, those are Oscars, and it won one for Best Visual Effects, and it also won an NDR award.
Yeah, to be fair, some of the visual effects in here, obviously, this was before CGI. So they did a lot of stuff with models, but they also did a lot of stuff like apparently the shot of the plane coming into the hangar and the big explosion, that was real. And when they're destroying the planes on the runway, that was real. So they did a lot of real explosions and all that stuff looked really cool.
Yeah, there's a really fun story about those planes outside the hangar that exploded. But we can talk about it when we get to that in the movie.
So let's talk about the plot. We open with an information card telling us about the attack on Pearl Harbor and that everything we're about to see is based on historical fact. And then we get a really long opening sequence where we're just panning over these long rows of Japanese sailors and ships and planes flying overhead. So we're seeing kind of the full might of the Japanese Navy.
And we hear a little bit of the soundtrack for this, which was apparently a mix of American and Japanese music.
That is neat. The first hour and 40 minutes of this movie is spent largely in various offices in the United States and Japan, as we're introduced to a revolving cast of characters based on real life people in the lead up to the events at Pearl Harbor. So there aren't really main characters, so to speak. We're getting the full shebang. Everyone who was
Everybody's
involved.
here. We first get introduced to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, played by So Yamamura, who's hoping not to go to war, but he is nevertheless planning a preemptive strike on the US Pacific Fleet. He believes that the only way for Japan to obtain control over the fleet and secure resources in Indochina is to get rid of the American fleet all at once. The US has imposed a trade embargo as of August 1939, due to, in large part, Japan's invasion of China, and the higher-ups in the army, the Japanese army, have secured an alliance with Germany and Italy, making Japan part of the Axis forces as of 1940.
Yeah, y'all will remember from when we covered the movie Pearl Harbor, Japan had these imperialist ambitions that were kicking off the beginning of the 20th century. They had invaded Manchuria in the early 30s, and that is sort of what prompted these escalating sanctions from the League of Nations. And of course, that didn't really prevent them from doing anything. And then they invaded China itself. And then there was the trade embargo on oil. And so this was sort of like an escalating situation that was getting increasingly dire. And the situation.
I appreciated the fact that it was made very obvious from the beginning that the Japanese weren't out to start a war. Like, it wasn't their main goal to just make war. They kind of wanted to defend what they had and their resources and that sort of stuff. And in Pearl Harbor, you don't really. It gets kind of mentioned a little bit, but it's a lot more clear in this movie.
Yeah, I think you can really tell that Michael Bay watched this movie and then all the stuff that he tried to do, showing the Japanese perspective versus the American perspective, was like a poor man's version of what was done in this movie. You know, just a very simplified, overdramatic, Hollywoodized version.
The scenes were similar, like the Japanese scenes in Pearl Harbor had a similar look of them being on the carrier and stuff inside. There were similar scenes to Tora. He had obviously really looked at it and decided, this is what I'm going to do, except I'm going to do it poorly.
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of go back and forth between Japan and the United States. And yes. So in the United States, we encounter Secretary Cordell Hull, played by George McCready. And he's discussing all of the failed attempts so far at diplomacy with Japan. He's talking about how they've been going back and forth, but negotiations have stalled. Obviously, they don't know that an attack or anything is coming yet, but he seems pretty discouraged.
And then we go back to Japan and we meet Air Staff Officer Minoru Ganda, played by Tatsuya Mihashi. Very sorry if I butcher all these names. Who will ultimately help plan the attack, as he's describing the new Zero to his friend, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Kishuda, played by Takahiro Tamura, who will lead the first wave of planes in the attack.
The cool thing as well is that Minoru Ganda in real life was a consultant on this movie, which I thought was kind of neat.
Yeah, that's very neat. At least we'll definitely know that it was accurate then.
Yeah.
And apparently many of the replica planes of the Japanese planes in this movie were also reused for the movie Midway, The Final Countdown in 1980, and in Pearl Harbor in 2001. So lots of reusing of rebuilt planes, everybody.
Yeah, that's cool. I gather that Midway is sort of a spiritual sequel to this movie. Like, it's not made by the same people, but In a similar vein, it tries to show both the Japanese and American perspectives at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, except it's a bit different because it actually has a main character and sort of a main plot line.
So it's a little bit more character driven than this one is, because this one very obviously is not. They make no effort to get you to feel any particular way about these characters. They're kind of using them to tell the story rather than focusing on them as people.
For sure. Yeah, the main character in this movie is Pearl Harbor. In the United States, the Japanese diplomatic codes have been broken. And we did touch on that in our Pearl Harbor episode as well, where they were able to break the diplomatic codes between the Japanese home government and the various embassies and diplomatic staff in the United States, but they hadn't broken the naval codes. So they were only getting sort of a little piece of the picture. So we meet Lieutenant Commander Kramer, played by Wesley Addy, and Colonel Rufus Bratton, played by E.G. Marshall. And they're talking about how only a few people are allowed to see these translated dispatches. And that's going to be important later, because when they find out that Pearl Harbor is coming, they're having to track down certain people on the weekend so that they can get briefcases open, but those people aren't around. So they're planting these little seeds now of, here are things that are going to make the Americans respond too late to effectively do anything about Pearl Harbor.
I particularly enjoyed Kramer, or Kramer's actor. As far as the acting in this movie goes, it's not about the acting so much, but I really enjoyed this man. I felt like the frustration with him a little bit more than I did with any of the other characters. So I don't know why, but I did.
Yeah, it was very much some dude who was just like, everyone around me doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I also enjoyed, I think his character was the one who ended up driving to the White House with his wife. And the whole way the wife was just like, so what are you going to tell the president? So what's going to happen when you get there? So, and just asking.
and then she brought in the most bad-looking hot dog I've ever seen.
So also in the United States, we have Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who's played by Martin Balsam. He's the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And he's getting these mixed signals from Washington. So he ends up telling his men to go on full alert, and he increases the air and naval patrols around Hawaii as a precautionary measure. And we also see Major General Walter Short, is played by Jason Robards. And he points out that there are something like 130,000 Japanese people living on Hawaii, and he's worried about the planes on the airfield being sabotaged. So he has all of his men move the planes at the airbase into a cluster. So it's harder to sabotage them, but it also obviously makes them super vulnerable to attack from the air.
Is it Admiral Husband E. Kimmel who points that out to him as well in that scene? I don't know. Someone points it out to him. He says something about not putting them in a cluster, and then he moves them. A couple of them later.
Yeah, I don't think it's Kimmel, but it is one of his men. You're right. And I actually wrote down the quote that one of them said, because throughout this movie, anytime the military brass does something dumb or inadvisable, people let them know about it. And the guy said, the way they're positioned now, a one-eyed monkey hanging from a 10-cent balloon could scatter them all to hell with just one hand grenade.
Hilarious.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Everybody in this movie thinks that everybody else is an idiot.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, and I mean, who among us hasn't worked at a job where we were the most competent person? And not pretending to be a rocket scientist, but I have worked at jobs before where I'm just like, does everyone around me know what they're doing, or just me?
So that scene makes it very clear that nobody has a bigger picture or has any idea what might be going on. Meanwhile, we also get to witness some army personnel as they are setting up a radar station. And if you've seen Pearl Harbor, you know that we see this radar station as well. And they run into all sorts of trouble. They don't have permission to put it up where they want to put it up because it's like an environmental hazard or something. I don't really remember.
Yeah,
and then they
like
have
a park or a nature preserve or something like that.
Yes, and then they have no phones either. So you'll find that communication was one of the reasons why the Americans were surprised by the Japanese.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the radar guys is like, how are we going to report to base if we find anything? And the guy's like, well, there's a gas station a mile down the road. They probably have a phone.
Yeah. A group of Japanese officers, including Yamamoto, argue over how many aircraft carriers they might need for their sneak attack. It's clear that they believe that the battle can't be won without air superiority, which we know the Americans are believed to be good at. by the Japanese. We see the Japanese begin to train for the attack, which was a pretty neat sequence, I thought, learning how to use the bomb sites and how to identify American ships. They laugh about it too, I believe, and they have a good old time training for this mission.
We do.
We never meet the Emperor called Hirohito, but he's referenced by other characters and he wants to avoid a war. I feel like we similarly don't get to meet the American president either, so.
Correct. Yeah. It's interesting to me because I don't know how much of a peace advocate Hirohito was in real life. There are parts of this movie where I'm like, I think part of it too is them never showing Hirohito or FDR. We're supposed to understand that by and large, all of this stuff sort of happens below them. Like the nitty gritty stuff never makes it to their desks or anything like that. So we really are seeing the people working, like the radio operators and all the sort of lower down guys, on what they're up to.
Yep. And we also see a lot of conflicting information going back and forth the entire time, especially,
Yeah.
I feel, with the Americans.
Yeah. And we often see in the movie, they'll show something happening on the American side, and then they'll immediately show a scene of the Japanese like reacting to it or doing something related. So we're seeing this kind of back and forth constantly.
I do get what you mean, though, by not quite trusting that everybody was as keen on avoiding war, because everybody in this movie seems to not want war. Except maybe the fighter pilots. They seem eager to get up in their planes. But other than that, nobody wants a war.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, even when this movie was made in 1970 and the war had been over for 25 years, any country that was involved in a war like that is going to want to not necessarily absolve themselves of responsibility, but nobody wants to come across as a war hawk in the wake of everything that happened. So I think that they may have been a little bit kinder to some of the figures in this movie than may have been merited on both sides.
I agree. So meanwhile, in the movie, diplomatic tensions continue to rise. We meet Ambassador Kishisoburo Nomura, played by Shogo Shimada, as he continues to negotiate with the Americans.
Yes.
The Japanese Navy has begun to move, but Yamamoto is adamant that they will turn back if peace can be achieved, which is a theme he keeps saying, as soon as there is a chance for peace, we will take it. So, again, they're very purposeful in saying that they do not want a war.
Right, which is funny when you think about the truly massive amount of time and resources that went into planning Pearl Harbor, and to have even it be implied that, well, this was just a backup plan in case diplomacy fell through. And it's like, well, actually, I think diplomacy was a backup plan in case Pearl Harbor fell through.
The week before the attack, Breton and Kramer intercept an ominous message on their code machine that seems to be Japanese high command telling the ambassador that negotiations must be wrapped up before the end of November. So they believe that the attack is imminent on November 30th, and they raise the alarm, but nothing happens, as we know. And we continue to follow various scenes of Americans getting warnings, loads of them, that the Japanese fleet is on the move, but nothing concrete. They cannot pinpoint the Japanese, they've lost them at this point. Although we never meet President FDR, we find out that he's not receiving any of the decoded Japanese diplomatic messages. So that's the point you made earlier. They were not involved in this at all. Or at least in this movie, they imply that they were not involved.
Yeah, it's just a breakdown in communications all around. Lots of little, like a comedy of errors, I guess.
And for me, the entire thing about the coded messages was the one thing in this movie that was actually tense. Like everything else was kind of boring, but this was incredibly tense. Because you can feel them kind of scrambling around, trying to figure it out and not being able to. I can imagine how annoying that must have been. And even in the Pearl Harbor movie, the codebreaker guy is the only one who's like certain that he knows something is going to happen, but he can't put his finger on it. So I'm sure Michael Bay got that from this movie as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like a lot of I would say especially the American characters in this movie speak to one another like they already have the benefit of hindsight. They already kind of know what's going to happen. And the way they say everything is very dramatic, and they're delivering these historical lines to each other and they know it. But I did feel at this part, there was some sense of tension and them scrambling to try and figure out what to do before it was too late. The night before the attack, Bratton and Kramer discover a series of 13 messages that have been intercepted on the way to the Japanese embassy in Washington. And there should have been a 14th message, but it won't be delivered until the following morning. As per usual, it's a whole matter of, well, they don't have enough people to properly decode and type this message, yada, yada, yada. And this ends up being the message that advises the embassy to destroy their code machines. And obviously, that's a warning that an attack is imminent. But it's also the weekend, as we discussed before. It's Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday morning. So it's difficult to get a hold of anyone or impress upon anyone the urgency of the situation.
Yeah, there's a scene that's slightly later in the movie. I'm not sure if we're going to discuss it, but there's a scene where someone says, I think it's when the radar guy picks something up and the other guy says, it's best evidence, not a problem anymore. Like, our shift is over. It's not our problem. I'm like, God damn it, guys, come on. It's so frustrating, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of that going around. So Bratton's warnings don't make it up the chain of command for, if you haven't realized by now that this whole situation is a clusterfuck, well, it is. The chief of naval operations, Harold Stark, as played by Edward Stark, delays calling Hawaii so he can speak to the president first. So he delays delivering the warning that this attack is coming because he's like, well, I got to talk to the president. And then Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, played by Keith Andes, tries to warn the base at Pearl Harbor, but the radio transmission can't get through because the weather is bad. And then they try and send a telegram, but they forget to mark it urgent. So it just gets thrown on a desk and nobody reads it in time.
It does seem to me like all of these near misses from the Americans might be a little bit of American storytelling. It feels like it's kind of a coincidence that they just didn't get through, that it's not really their fault. But I feel like it must have been, someone must have known how stupid it all was, how big the mistakes were.
I think it's like what you were saying earlier. So many people who decided that something was out of their pay grade or tried to pass on a warning or a message and someone else didn't think it was important or it dropped the ball somewhere. Or it's just a whole bunch of people who kind of were operating in their own little silos and didn't necessarily like connect the dots with each other.
Yeah, and then there's also, I don't quite know, is there a time difference between Washington and Hawaii?
Yeah.
So there's also a time difference, which also plays a part a little bit later on the movie as well. I think the Japanese are also meant to hand over an official declaration of war just before the attack begins. But because of the time difference, they all get confused, and the declaration of war ends up being half an hour late.
Oh, yeah. That's got to be like a 6-hour time difference. Like, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, so there's lots of confusion even on the Japanese side about time as well.
Yeah. They wanted to declare war and then attack Pearl Harbor like half an hour later because they knew that wouldn't be enough warning for the Americans to do anything about it.
But then they mess it up and it arrives half an hour after the attack.
Yeah. So December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. First thing in the morning, as discussed, the radar operators attempt to pass on a warning, but they're ignored because the planes are believed to be friendlies. And the destroyer, the USS Ward, sinks a Japanese submarine by the mouth of the harbor. But again, they try and pass on the message, and the higher ups are like, it's just an isolated incident. Don't worry about it. And then the attack begins, and the Japanese cry of Tora, Tora, Tora signals that the attack was a surprise, as expected. And the Tora in the title literally means tiger in Japanese, but it's actually an abbreviation of a 2-syllable code word, Totsugeki Reigeki, which means lightning attack.
Super fast attack, which was what it was. Yeah. So also in the movie, when the Japanese characters refer to the date of the attack, in Japanese, they say December 8th, because in Japan it would be December 8th. But for the movie, they've just translated it to December 7th, because they didn't want it to be very confusing for the Americans.
Right. As the Japanese planes approach, they pass by a woman who's training a civilian pilot to fly. And this, what I thought was really cool, this is actually based on a real life pilot named Cornelia Clark Fort, as played by Jeff Donnell in the movie. And in fact, she did take control over the plane and made a successful landing, but their plane was strafed while they were landing, and her passenger had to run for their lives. And someone working at the airport was killed. So it's a whole thing. And then she ended up the following year, she became a member of the Women Air Force Service Pilots. And she actually became, unfortunately, the first American female pilot to die on active duty while ferrying a plane across the country in March of 1943.
Sad that she
Yeah.
died. Yeah, I'm like, she's so cool and then she dies. But that's how it always goes, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of that going around in World War II.
Do we think everybody who listens to our pod knows what strafing is? Strafing is when you get hit by another plane, right? When you get shot by a
Yeah,
plane.
they were being shot from the sky by Japanese Zeros.
There we go. And then we also get to see a character we see in Pearl Harbor, who's Petty Officer Third Class Doris Miller. And if you remember, he was the first black recipient of the Navy Cross. That was
Yeah,
nice to see him again.
yeah, and they tried to put him in for a Medal of Honor, I believe, but he didn't get it for racism reasons.
Probably.
Yep, and
And
he unfortunately died in the war.
yes. And we also see another interesting character. He's not named in the movie, but we see Chief Ordnanceman John Finn. You see him wounded and shooting at planes. He set off a 50 caliber machine gun, despite being wounded several times, and fired back at strafing Zeros during the second attack wave. He hit several of them and shot one down as well. Finn was later awarded the Medal of Honor. I don't know if he's in Pearl Harbor or not, but it seems to me like it's a familiar image.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this movie too features those two pilots, and I'm the worst because I don't remember their names, but the two real life pilots who were
Yeah.
assigned to a different air base, and then they ended up being the only two who were able to get their P-40s off the ground during Pearl Harbor and were able to take down a couple of Japanese planes.
They're probably the ones that Danny and Rafe are kind of based upon.
Yeah.
But we don't really see them do any cool shit in this movie.
Yeah, although we do get some really cool scenes of these P-40s being blown up on the ground. They're trying to take off and they keep getting blown up.
Yeah. So that's the one I wanted to talk about, because one of those P-40s was a motorized 2-scale model of one of these planes. And it had loads of explosives on it, and it was not meant to fly. But you see it kind of trying to get off the ground, which was an accident. And then it kind of topples over and goes into the other planes that also have explosives on them. So when you see all those people running away, they're actually running for their lives, because that wasn't supposed to happen.
I feel like this happened a lot in older movies. You know, there's like the famous chariot races, I think, in like Ben-Hur and stuff, where it's like, oh, a bunch of real people were injured, and you know, they just kind of were like, oh, you guys almost died in an explosion. Cool, we're gonna keep it in the movie.
But you get so many cool scenes from it, because you even see like the little propeller kind of shooting off the plane, which was also an accident. So all those scenes are completely real. No one's actually... all the stunt people are probably in danger a little bit.
Yeah. They also had explained earlier in the movie that Pearl Harbor they thought was too shallow to drop torpedoes from planes, but they keep referencing the fact that the British had done it at this other attack, and then they ended up designing these specialized torpedoes so they could be used at Pearl Harbor in the shallow water. So we get to see those destroying the heck out of a whole bunch of ships, and we get to see, well, what happened in real life. A lot of men ended up being trapped below deck, unfortunately, and drowned.
Yeah, I have some feelings about these explosion scenes, because I thought they were cool, but I also thought there weren't enough people in the harbor for it to seem as chaotic as I think it would have been. Like, I don't need them to be on the ships because that would have been dangerous, but I feel like the harbor was so empty. It's like, where are all the people? But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, we don't get any nurses or anything in this movie either. There's the odd female character, but we don't get any actually at Pearl Harbor.
I feel like we get to the wife in the car is one of them, and the other one is the type near the code room. He gets a couple lines, but that's all we get.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, you're right. It was weird. It was like they didn't have enough extras or something in that scene.
It seemed it was like a beautiful day, and there was just sunshine, and they were like on a cruiser before, and then suddenly there's ships blowing up, and there wasn't quite enough chaos for me, personally.
Oh my God. Can you please talk about the national anthem?
Yes, I can. So they play the national anthem twice in this movie. The first time it goes alright because there's not an attack happening, but the second time they are playing the national anthem on a ship, and something crazy happens that'll make you frown. It made me frown and then laugh really hard. Because apparently it was against protocol to end the national anthem before it was finished. So they were playing the national anthem on the ship, and then the attack begins. And the conductor of this band speeds up the national anthem so he can get it finished before he gets blown up.
Right. They're playing the Star-Spangled Banner at like 8 times the speed while planes are just dropping bombs all around them. And it's very like, it's not supposed to be funny, but it's a little funny.
Yeah, it's a very serious matter. But then they do nearly get blown up, I believe, as well. So I understand the haste.
Yeah. Yes, I too understand the haste. Okay, so this whole battle scene is really cool. If if you want to watch a cool Pearl Harbor battle scene, I would probably say watch this one instead of the Michael Bay one, because Michael Bay definitely blatantly ripped off this movie in a lot of ways. But yeah, so we get this battle scene, and actually during Pearl Harbor, we had talked about how the Pearl Harbor itself doesn't start until like an hour and a half into the movie. And in this movie, Pearl Harbor doesn't start till like an hour and 40 minutes into the movie, but I was much less mad about it in this movie.
Yeah, I thought that after about 40 minutes of dialogue, I was kind of done with all the dialogue, but then it got exciting, so I also did not mind.
Yeah. So
I don't know. I feel like the attack is not even that long. It's maybe 15 minutes or something. It's not super long.
No, it's not super long because the movie runtime is maybe 2 hours and 24 minutes, I think. And then it's not Pearl Harbor. And then Pearl Harbor starts around an hour and 40 minutes. And then there's definitely a few scenes after it. So I would say max maybe 20, 25 minutes.
Yeah.
So in Washington, as we discussed earlier, the Japanese delegates were supposed to declare war on the United States officially before Pearl Harbor was attacked, but they were late. And they're waiting outside of Secretary of State Cordell Hull's office, and he's on the phone, and he's like, wait. Are you sure Pearl Harbor just got attacked by the Japanese?
What just happened?
Yeah.
Because they're right outside my office.
Right. So just like picture the tension of this scene, right? The Japanese diplomats come into his office, and he knows Pearl Harbor's just been attacked, and they don't know that Pearl Harbor has just been attacked. And he says, the comment that he makes is taken from real life, and he says, I must say that in all my conversations with you during the last 9 months, I never uttered one word of untruth. This is borne out absolutely by the record. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. And yeah, so just imagine exactly how that meeting went. And of course, the Japanese diplomats get thrown out of his office. And we know that this happened word for word because the Pearl Harbor Commission actually investigated and documented all these events pretty much word for word afterwards, which is where a lot of the information from this movie comes from. And it was called the Roberts Commission after the Supreme Court judge who chaired it. And they actually found Kimmel and Short guilty of dereliction of duty. And this movie, I think, goes a little bit towards sort of redeeming them a little bit and saying, like, look, they didn't have a full picture, much like everyone. So it wasn't really their fault specifically. And this commission actually ended up being the model for the 9/11 Commission. But unfortunately, the report that it generated was a little bit controversial because it seemed to imply, I guess, that a lot of Japanese Americans might be spies. And of course, people took that and ran with it. And we know that Japanese Americans did not have a very good time in the United States during World War II.
No, that would have been a tough time. Imagine living on the island, just being there after the attack. Been harsh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kimmel then is nearly hit by a bullet as he watches from his office window or a window at the destruction outside. And he says, it would be merciful if it had killed me. And apparently he also said that in real life.
Yeah, apparently the actor thought that line was a bit too overdramatic, and they had to tell him, like, no, the guy actually said that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, at least I felt that from him as well, because there's 2 officers, I don't know who they are, standing outside when the attack happens, and they look at the planes for a good 5 minutes before they start running, and I'm like, why aren't you more horrified? But that's just the acting. Like, a lot of the acting is just people staring at stuff or each other.
Yeah, a lot of silence for dramatic effect.
Yep.
Yeah. So and he, of course, Kimmel is not going to receive the telegram warning about the attack until after the attack is over, which is not very useful.
That must have been so frustrating to receive that telegram after it was too late.
Well, especially because you got to know if you're him that your head's going to roll, right? Like people are going to
Yeah.
hold you responsible.
Yep.
So Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, played by Ijiro Tono, elects not to send a third wave of aircraft, which we also saw in the movie Pearl Harbor. The Japanese sent 2 waves in the attack, and then they were going to send a third, and they decided not to. And the reason why is articulated a little bit better in this movie. He's worried that American submarines are going to sort of rally and be able to attack them. And also, there were a whole bunch of American aircraft carriers that the Japanese had thought were going to be at Pearl Harbor. And a huge part of their plan was being able to destroy those aircraft carriers because, as we discussed, they knew that supremacy over the air was going to be huge during this upcoming war. And so they had wanted to destroy these aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers happened to not be there because they had gone out on a mission. And so he was worried that these aircraft carriers would come back. And at that point, the Japanese would be in deep shit, so to speak. And so he elects not to send this third wave. They're going to pull back. But a lot of other officers are very critical of this decision.
Yeah, and then we get the famous line, I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve.
Yeah, and that's Yamamoto essentially saying to his staff, like, look, we haven't been able to destroy these American aircraft carriers, and the Americans are going to be super pissed that we attacked them before we declared war.
Yeah, he seems the entire time in this movie, I find him to be kind of almost disappointed that he has to go to war, that he has to do this attack, because even when they call Tora 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 over the radio, there's a shot of him just closing his eyes, like in disappointment, it seems. I thought that was a really interesting choice to portray Yamamoto as this really reluctant leader, almost.
Yeah, I think we know from real life that he was well aware that in order for this attack to be successful, it would have to be a surprise because if the Americans turn the full might of their army towards Japan, we have a quote from him in real life where he says, I think we'll only be able to cause havoc with them for a year or 18 months. So he's fully aware that if a war gets started here, it's going to be an uphill slog. So I think you're right that the way they depicted him as being not necessarily reluctant to go to war, maybe, but he kind of has some idea of where the chips are going to fall on this one.
Yeah, I thought his actor was really good, by the way. I really enjoyed this actor.
Yeah,
And
I agree. I would say maybe the strongest performance in the movie.
I agree too. I feel the same way. I read up a little about this line, the last line that's uttered, and apparently it was not said by him. It's either like a Hollywood invention or it's in a diary somewhere, but it's not said by Yamamoto, but it fits. And it was already a famous line when they made the movie. It wasn't made famous by the movie itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think he also says it in Pearl Harbor, right? That Michael Bay recycled that.
Yeah, he did. And then I think, was it Bush that kind of referenced this after the 9/11 attacks as well?
Yeah, he said something like they've awakened a mighty giant or something. He tried to paraphrase this anyways.
Yeah, but it might have also been in a book, which I'm about to mention, because the producer, Elmer Williams, he wanted to make the film as historically accurate as possible. So he sought out Professor Gordon W. Branch, and he was back then regarded as the foremost authority on the attack of Pearl Harbor. And one of Branch's books was called Tora Tora Tora, and it was a huge bestseller in Japan. So it provided a great resource for this film.
Yeah.
So that's the movie.
That is the movie. Is there anything from your notes that we didn't talk about that you want to bring up?
I don't know. Let me see. I said in my notes, there's barely any emotion. I'm not sure if I still feel that way today, but I felt that way yesterday after I watched it. There's barely any emotion where Pearl Harbor had too much emotion. I almost felt like this didn't have enough of it. I still feel like that's a little bit. I wish there had been a little more acting in this. Like, especially from the American, I wish it had been slightly less dry. But also, because it's not character-based, this movie, it makes it hard to get that emotion in, so I do get it.
Right. We're only seeing each character with the exception of a couple, obviously, maybe once or twice. And I think as an actor, it's probably really hard to get into that character when you only have one or two lines and zero background information.
Yeah. And there was one particular bit of like storytelling that they tried to do that I really appreciated. It was by showing a clock on the wall many, many times. They were trying to kind of rack up the tension as it came nearer to the attack, and they kept showing the clock on the wall because of that message that was supposed to be delivered at 1 o'clock. But I did find it rather confusing because of the different time zones. So I was a little confused about what was happening when. I like that they tried to use some like visual aid to display that urgency in there.
Yeah.
And also, I didn't really know about the objective to destroy the carriers initially, the Japanese, that they wanted first and foremost to destroy the carriers. Because I don't think it's mentioned in Pearl Harbor at all.
Well, they don't. It's certainly, I would say, this movie articulates a lot of things better than Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor. Definitely, they go into people's motivations a bit more. It's not so simplistic and facile. But I mean, I can imagine that this movie gets shown a lot in schools. You know, it's very has that kind of documentary feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like a documentary with acting in it instead of a voiceover.
Yeah.
That's it for my notes.
One thing I wanted to bring up, seeing the two different perspectives, the Japanese side and the American side of things get really fleshed out, got me thinking about perspectives on the whole. And of course, we know that the root of all of this is happening is this clash of imperialist goals between Japan and the Western powers, right? Japan is attacking Pearl Harbor so that they can get the American fleet on the back foot. And when that happens, they're going to kind of blitzkrieg and take over all these colonies that were previously occupied by like the British, the French, the Americans, the Dutch, all these different people.
Yeah.
And I find that this history is often discussed in a way where it's two world powers jostling over land and just land, like territory, wherein we don't really envision or take into account in any significant way the millions of people who were not Japanese or American who lived there and had lived there generations, you know, people whose lives and nationhoods were very much at stake and were not consulted over whether they'd like to be occupied one way or the other. And reading a book right now called What is America by Ronald Wright. And I had read it in university and I'm rereading it. And he talks about how there's this funny thing in the way that we talk about the history of like the New World, where there's this idea that the land was vast and pristine and untouched and largely uninhabited. And in fact, we know from accounts of explorers at the time and subsequent archaeological finds that in fact, huge swaths of North, Central, and South America had actually been cleared as farmland. And there were towns and cities with buildings and streets and forts and markets and palaces and what have you. And so like, proper civilization. And those people and the civilizations they built tend to be overlooked when we talk about the history of the Americas. And again, when we talk about the expansion of specifically the United States and Canada, because I know a bit more about that, there's this Go West young man that grew up with the country. It's about pushing past this frontier, boldly going where no man has gone before, except, of course, all the people who already live there.
Even if it's not your land and someone already lives there.
Right. It's this story of a conquest of land versus a conquest of people. And there's a very specific way that story is told. And I feel like the way we talk about World War II sometimes falls into that tradition of erasing people who are not central to call it like our version of the narrative.
But
Go ahead.
Isn't it in general, not just the way we talk about World War II, but the way we talk about war in general? Isn't it almost always about countries, maybe nations, but never people, land, but never people, resources, but never people? I feel like it's happening now too. In Israel and Gaza and in Ukraine, it's all about land, even though there's lots of people there. And it's just the narratives, when it becomes dehumanized like that, it must be easier for the countries involved to justify what they are doing. Because if you talk about the people, then you're going to have to admit to yourself that you're doing atrocious things to human beings.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's worse now than it was in World War II, or if it's just as bad.
I think that some of us live in places or come from backgrounds where we're fortunate, and it's easy to forget that the colonization and imperialism of the 16th through 19th centuries really did cast a really long shadow well into the 20th century. I mean,
Yeah.
even like the island of Hawaii itself, right, was an indigenous sovereign nation. And then it had the misfortune of being in a strategically valuable location. So as the 19th century wore on, the Americans encroached, they built a naval base. They actually paid for the drainage and expansion of Pearl Harbor because the harbor itself wasn't deep enough for ships to dock at one time. And then at the end of the 19th century, they overthrew the Kingdom of Hawaii. And so it's these two powers fighting over these different pieces of the world where it's questionable their right to be fighting over to begin with.
Doesn't it, like, to me it seems like these world powers, I know the Dutch did a bunch of it as well back in the day. Like, it's such an arrogant thing to do, really, to think yourself so much better that you can just go in there, just take what's not yours. It's just so rude.
Yeah. So I guess I just wanted to bring that up because I just thought it was neat. You know, this movie takes such care to really get these two different perspectives really fleshed out. And then it kind of made me interested in tracking down more work by people whose perspectives we see less often. You know, there's obviously there was tons of people living in these places that really had nothing to do with either of those empires.
Definitely. I'm really interested to watch more movies about different points of view on World War II specifically, but also aside from this podcast, just to see how other countries think about war and how blind I've been for many years. I don't think I am anymore, but it's so easy to believe everything they are telling you. It's difficult to make up your own mind sometimes about stuff like this.
For sure. Well, and we're all a work in progress and we're learning all the time. I've
learned so much in the past like 2.5 months that we've been doing this podcast, man. I just really enjoy it as well. It makes me feel like a more well-rounded human.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for not just watching the movies, but like really having a chance to talk about it and think about it and hash it out, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I actually downloaded a World War II movie from the Philippines called Ora Plata Mata, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm looking forward to watching that too.
We should briefly mention why we are watching that movie, or why you are. I might watch a different one. But in our next episode, we have a Filipino guest with us, and we will be discussing some more different points of view. So that will be really interesting.
Yeah, really looking forward to it.
We do still need to rate this movie. What are we rating it out of?
We are going to rate it hastily finished national anthems out of 10.
Yes. Should I go first?
I'll let you go first because I know you always feel like you're copying me, so I'll feel like I'm copying you.
Right. Perfect. I thought about this long and hard because when the movie started, I didn't think I was going to enjoy it based on the first 20 minutes, but then it got good. But I do feel like it lacks a little in the storytelling department, which is something I really like. So for me, I'm gonna give it a 6.8, which is not very high, but I really liked the historical accuracy and I liked learning about the exact event. But I didn't really like the way the story was told. So that's where the 6.8 comes from. How about you?
Yeah, I agree that it didn't really have any kind of anything to say about the characters or the human condition or any overarching themes. There wasn't really a message beyond here is a blow by blow of what happened leading up to Pearl Harbor, which again, if you're in the mood for that kind of movie and you're a history buff, you're probably going to like this. And again, the action scene in Pearl Harbor itself is really good. The first part of this movie does feel like, you know, sitting in a lot of offices. So yeah, I'll probably give it a 6. Like I said, there was parts of it that I enjoyed, but it did feel like a little bit of a slog at certain points.
I feel like I just give higher ratings than you in general.
Well, just more critical. I looked up a few reviews for this movie because I was just curious. Like, obviously, it was made in 1970, so a little bit before my time. And apparently, Roger Ebert said, Tora, Tora, Tora is one of the deadest, dullest blockbusters ever made.
And I don't know if you read this, but he gave Pearl Harbor a higher rating than he did Tora.
Right. Well, that's absolutely foolish, and he's wrong about that. Sorry, the ghost of Roger Ebert. But I also looked up some reviews on Letterboxd, so I'm going to read you my favorite ones. I have this movie had 3 directors, and it feels like it. I cannot comment on the actual attack on Pearl Harbor after the intermission, which is probably more exciting, but unfortunately at that point I was deeply asleep. I also have another one where this person rated it half a star, and they said, if you like sitting in meetings, you'll love this movie.
I should show it to my boss then, I guess.
Yeah. And there's one, they rated it 1 star, and they said, for a film that's about a world famous naval battle, it sure is dry. This person was a bit kinder. They said, at least Ben Affleck wasn't trying to decide to shoot back or make out with his girlfriend in this one. And then this person rated it 5 stars, and they said, okay, so mistakes were made, but we got that ass when they came to Midway.
Yes. God, these are hilarious.
They're really funny. Yeah. There was one that I thought was funny, but I also thought was like pretty on point. They said, I just felt like I was watching one of those old Disney educational reels about driving or meat packing or something. Most of the characters come and go like cardboard cutouts.
They do, though. It's got that old-timey walking again in it, too. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a lot of unnecessary walking in this movie. Like,
Yeah.
why are we getting shown this? Why can we not just cut to the next room?
Right. And we really did our best to mention specific characters and actors, but there's probably dozens of them that we missed because there's just too many. And because they tried to be really historically accurate, they didn't amalgamate any characters. So you'll see
You
like
get everyone.
Yeah, you'll get this radar operator on the left and he speaks once, and then in the next scene it's like a different radar operator, and so it's really hard to follow who everybody is.
Yeah. I did like when they introduce the characters who were actual people, they show it on screen for like a second, but it's so fast that by the time you finished reading, it's already skipped to the next scene. So there's another name and you're like, wait a second, who am I looking at?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they never refer to each other by name. They just all say commander or sir, or so you have no idea who's speaking.
Yeah, it's a lot of title salad, that's for sure.
But I guess we have that one in the bag.
We do have that one in the bag. Are you reading anything interesting?
I am reading a book, actually. Well done, me. I'm reading a book called We Were the Lucky Ones. And there's also a TV show called this. And it's about a Jewish family in Poland during the war. And it's about their struggle to survive the war, but then also to find each other once the war is over. And it's apparently a real story, like it actually happened. This family actually existed. And I feel like we should watch the show and also read the book and then talk about it on the show.
Yeah, you're reading topical World War II stuff. Good for you.
Yeah. And other than that, what else am I listening to or reading? I don't know. Am I doing anything else? I've been doing lots of website building, actually.
Ooh.
I think by the time this episode airs, it might be live. So you can find us on rosieTheReviewer.com now.
Very exciting. And of course, you can follow us as always at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast on Instagram. And you can follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars.
We're also on IMDb, by the way. You can rate us there as well.
Oh my God. We're going to be literally everywhere. And y'all, when I tell you that I am not responsible for any of this, like, this is a Mart project. She's getting us everywhere. I love it.
I'm sorry. I'm just obsessed with us.
It's really valid of you. No, I appreciate it.
Are you reading anything other than the book you already mentioned?
Nope, that's pretty much it. I have exams next week, so I'm trying to drill down and learn me some things and hopefully retain some information in this old gray matter of mine.
Very good. I feel like you're good at retaining information, so I wish you the best of luck, and I believe in you. You can do this.
Thanks, man.
Okay, see you next week.
Bye.